John Pilger, War by Media and the Triumph of Propaganda. John Pilger's address to the Logan Symposium in London. The war you don't see: building an alliance against secrecy, surveillance and censorship. Why has so much journalism succumbed to propaganda? Why are censorship and distortion standard practice? Why is the BBC so often a mouthpiece of rapacious power? Why do the New York Times and the Washington Post deceive their readers? Why are young journalists not taught to understand media agendas and to challenge the high claims and low purpose of fake objectivity? And why are they not taught that the essence of so much of what's called the mainstream media is not information, but power? These are urgent questions. The world is facing the prospect of major war, perhaps nuclear war, with the United States clearly determined to isolate and provoke Russia and eventually China. This truth is being turned upside down and inside out by journalists, including those who promoted the lies that led to the bloodbath in Iraq in 2003. The times we live in are so dangerous and so distorted in public perception that propaganda is no longer, as Edward Bernays called it, an invisible government. It is the government. It rules directly without fear of contradiction, and its principal aim is the conquest of us, our sense of the world, our ability to separate truth from lies. The information age is actually a media age. We have war by media, censorship by media, demonology by media, retribution by media, diversion by media, a surreal assembly line of obedient cliches and false assumptions. This power to create a new reality has been building for a long time. 45 years ago, a book entitled The Greening of America caused a sensation. On the cover were these words: "There is a revolution coming. It will not be like revolutions of the past. It will originate with the individual." I was a correspondent in the United States at the time and recall the overnight elevation to guru status of the author, a young Yale academic, Charles Reich. His message was that truth-telling and political action had failed and only culture and introspection could change the world. Within a few years, driven by the forces of profit, the cult of meism had all but overwhelmed our sense of acting together, our sense of social justice and internationalism. Class, gender and race were separated. The personal was the political, and the media was the message. In the wake of the Cold War, the fabrication of new threats completed the political disorientation of those who, 20 years earlier, would have formed a vehement opposition. In 2003, I filmed an interview in Washington with Charles Lewis, the distinguished American investigative journalist. We discussed the invasion of Iraq a few months earlier. I asked him, what if the freest media in the world had seriously challenged George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and investigated their claims, instead of channeling what turned out to be crude propaganda? Bush declaring the end of major combat in Iraq on May 1, 2003, he replied that if we journalists had done our job, there is a very good chance we would have not gone to war in Iraq. That's a shocking statement, and one supported by other famous journalists to whom I put the same question. Dan Rather, formerly of CBS, gave me the same answer. David Rose of The Observer and senior journalists and producers in the BBC, who wished to remain anonymous, gave me the same answer. In other words, had journalists done their job, had they questioned and investigated the propaganda instead of amplifying it, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children might be alive today, and millions might not have fled their homes, the sectarian war between Sunni and Shia might not have ignited, and the infamous Islamic State might not now exist. Even now, despite the millions who took to the streets in protest, most of the public in Western countries have little idea of the sheer scale of the crime committed by our governments in Iraq. Even fewer are aware that, in the 12 years before the invasion, the US and British governments set in motion a Holocaust by denying the civilian population of Iraq a means to live. Those are the words of the senior British official responsible for sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s, a medieval siege that caused the deaths of 500,000 children under the age of 5, reported UNICEF. The official's name is Karn Ross. In the Foreign Office in London, he was known as Mr. Iraq. Today, he is a truth-teller of how governments deceive and how journalists willingly spread the deception. We would feed journalists factoids of sanitized intelligence, he told me, or we'd freeze them out. The main whistleblower during this terrible, silent period was Dennis Halliday, then Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the senior UN official in Iraq. Halliday resigned rather than implement policies he described as genocidal. He estimates that sanctions killed more than 1 million Iraqis. What then happened to Halliday was instructive. He was airbrushed. Or he was vilified. On the BBC's Newsnight program, the presenter Jeremy Paxman shouted at him, "Aren't you just an apologist for Saddam Hussein?" The Guardian recently described this as one of Paxman's memorable moments. Last week, Paxman signed a $1 million book deal. The handmaidens of suppression have done their job well. Consider the effects. In 2013, a Comres poll found that a majority of the British public believed the casualty toll in Iraq was less than 10,000, a tiny fraction of the truth. A trail of blood that goes from Iraq to London has been scrubbed almost clean. Rupert Murdoch is said to be the godfather of the media mob, and no one should doubt the augmented power of his newspapers, all 127 of them, with a combined circulation of 40 million, and his Fox network. But the influence of Murdoch's empire is no greater than its reflection of the wider media. The most effective propaganda is found not in the Sun or on Fox News, but beneath a liberal halo. When the New York Times published claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, its fake evidence was believed, because it wasn't Fox News, it was the New York Times. The same is true of the Washington Post and the Guardian, both of which have played a critical role in conditioning their readers to accept a new and dangerous Cold War. All three liberal newspapers have misrepresented events in Ukraine as a malign act by Russia, when, in fact, the fascist-led coup in Ukraine was the work of the United States, aided by Germany and NATO. This inversion of reality is so pervasive that Washington's military encirclement and intimidation of Russia is not contentious. It's not even news,